The night was silent, but one phone call shattered everything. On the other end wasn't a doctor, not a trusted friend, but a young black girl with urgency in her trembling voice. She claimed his only son, a boy born into privilege, was lying unconscious on a street corner, surrounded by strangers who did nothing. For a billionaire used to control, this was chaos he could not buy his way out of. Who was this girl? How did she even have his private number? And more importantly, what secret about his son was she about to reveal? Viewers, stay with me, because what began as an unexpected call would uncover a truth that money, power, and influence could never bury. Wealth has a way of building walls so high that those on the inside forget what life looks like beyond them. For decades, Victor Harrington, a self-made billionaire, lived behind those walls. His empire stretched across technology, real estate, and finance. To the world, he was the embodiment of success, a man who climbed from modest beginnings to command respect in boardrooms filled with men who had once doubted him. He had the money, the influence, the networks, and the polished smile of a man convinced his family's future was unshakable. But beneath that polished surface, his household was far more fragile than the headlines suggested. Victor's wife had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise their only child, Andrew, on his own. Though the boy grew up with private tutors, international schools, and the best that wealth could buy, Victor often compensated for his absence with lavish gifts and endless allowances. To him, ensuring his son never wanted for anything meant he was doing his duty. But reality painted a different picture. Andrew, now in his early 20s, was adrift. His father's wealth was both a safety net and a chain, shielding him from consequences, but leaving him without purpose. Nights blurred into dawns spent at exclusive clubs, fueled by excess. While the public believed he was the golden heir, those who crossed paths with him outside the glitter of high society whispered about a young man unraveling. Still, Victor never allowed himself to see it. He assumed youth was meant for mistakes, and that his son's rough edges would polish out with age. He just needs time, he often told himself, and eventually he'll settle into his role. But time wasn't a luxury Andrew had, not in the way his father imagined. On the other side of town, a very different life was unfolding. Maya Williams was only 19. Raised by her grandmother in a struggling neighborhood, her life had been defined by responsibility and resilience. From a young age, she had learned to stretch pennies into meals, juggle school with part-time work, and shield her younger cousins from the harsh realities of poverty. Her world was the complete opposite of marble floors, penthouse views, and chauffeur-driven cars. But what Maya lacked in material wealth, she carried in determination. She wanted more than survival. She wanted meaning. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, of being able to provide for her grandmother and create a life where her family didn't have to fight for every dollar. Every day she studied harder, worked longer shifts at the diner, and pushed through exhaustion. Life was never easy, but her spirit burned bright. The night their worlds collided seemed, at first, ordinary. Victor was hosting yet another gala downtown. It was one of those extravagant evenings where champagne never stopped flowing, where laughter echoed from crystal chandeliers, and where the city's elite gathered to parade their success. Andrew was expected to attend, but as usual he slipped away. To him these gatherings were suffocating, filled with people who looked at him not as a person, but as a future inheritance. Instead, Andrew chose the chaos of the city streets, seeking escape in the one place his father's name carried no weight. He wandered aimlessly, his head foggy from alcohol and frustration, until he stumbled into a crowd outside a rundown convenience store. That's where Maya spotted him. At first, she didn't recognize him. All she saw was a young man slumped against a wall, his breathing shallow, his skin pale beneath the harsh glow of a flickering streetlight. The crowd around him wasn't helping. Some pulled out their phones, others whispered, and a few laughed cruelly as if another person's misfortune was entertainment. Maya's instinct kicked in. She pushed past them, kneeling at his side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice steady though her heart raced. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His pulse was faint. His chest rose unevenly. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She shouted for someone to call an ambulance, but the crowd hesitated, their attention more on capturing the moment than saving a life. Furious, Maya grabbed her phone. She could call 911 herself, but as she reached for it, she noticed something. In his wallet, half fallen from his pocket, was an ID card with the name Andrew Harrington. Her heart froze. She had seen that name before, on news articles, headlines, even on billboards tied to his father's empire. Billionaire's son, the golden heir, the boy lying unconscious at her feet. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't waste time. She dialed 911 first, then made a decision that felt insane even to her. On the back of his ID was an emergency contact number, likely his father's. She hesitated, but something inside told her this was bigger than calling an ambulance. Whoever this man was, he needed someone who cared enough to fight for him. The phone rang once, twice, then a deep, stern voice answered. "Who is this?" "How did you get this number?" For a moment, Maya almost hung up. But then she looked at Andrew's limp body, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, and forced the words out. "This is Maya. I don't know you, but your son is unconscious. He's lying on the street. And if you don't come now, I don't think he's going to make it." There was silence. Heavy, dangerous silence. Then, in a voice barely controlled, Victor demanded details, location, condition, everything she could give. She told him everything she knew, her words urgent but precise. Within minutes, Victor's world cracked open. For the first time, the billionaire who believed his money could solve everything was utterly powerless. No amount of wealth, no boardroom connections, no carefully guarded reputation could shield him from the truth. His son was dying on a sidewalk, and the only person standing between life and death was a stranger from a world he'd spent his life ignoring. That night, the walls Victor had built began to crumble, and Maya, unknown, unseen, underestimated, was about to play a role that neither wealth nor power could predict. The moment Maya ended the call, she stared down at the boy in front of her, her mind racing. Siren still hadn't come. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, praying she hadn't lost him already. His pulse flickered weakly, enough to tell her she had time, but not much. The crowd had already begun to thin out, bored once they realized no fight or spectacle would break out. That was the cruelty of the city. Suffering wasn't worth attention, unless it was entertaining. Maya was furious, but she swallowed it, forcing herself to focus on Andrew. "Stay with me," she whispered under her breath, though he couldn't hear. She propped him slightly onto his side, making sure he didn't choke. Her grandmother had taught her basic first aid, lessons she clung to now like a lifeline. Finally, in the distance, she heard the faint wail of an ambulance. Relief rushed through her, but it was fleeting. She knew what came next. Paramedics would take over, but without someone who cared enough to advocate, a boy like him could become just another name on a report. That thought made her grip her phone tighter. She had done her part, but something told her this wasn't over. Meanwhile, across town, Victor Harrington was living a nightmare. At the gala, his phone had buzzed, a disruption he rarely tolerated. But when he heard the voice of an unfamiliar girl and the words, "Your son is unconscious," his world snapped. Without a word to anyone, he stormed out, leaving startled executives and confused guests behind. His driver tried to keep pace as Victor barked directions, his heart pounding. He didn't even notice that his hands trembled, something they hadn't done since his earliest days in business. For years, he had convinced himself Andrew was fine. That indulgence was temporary. The boys would be boys and money would clean up any mess. But hearing that his son was lying in the street, helpless, it stripped away every illusion he had built. By the time Victor's car screeched up to the scene, paramedics were loading Andrew onto a stretcher. The billionaire shoved past them, his usually composed voice breaking as he demanded answers. "What happened? Is he breathing? What's wrong with him?" The medics assured him his son was alive but critical, and they needed to move fast. Victor followed, but something caught his attention. A girl, standing to the side, her hands shaking, her clothes plain, her face etched with exhaustion and determination. She didn't belong to his world, and yet every instinct told him she was the one who had called. Their eyes met briefly. For a fraction of a second, Victor saw gratitude and anger mixed in hers, as if she was relieved Andrew was being helped, but furious that it had taken so long. Inside the ambulance, Andrew's condition remained fragile. Oxygen hissed through the mask pressed to his face. Machines beeped frantically, and the medics shouted medical jargon Victor barely comprehended. He sat frozen, the sound of his son's labored breaths louder than any boardroom debate he had ever faced. At the hospital, chaos exploded. Nurses rushed Andrew into the emergency room, while doctors swarmed, asking questions Victor struggled to answer. What had Andrew been doing? Did he take anything? Did he have allergies? The more they asked, the more Victor realized how little he knew about his own son. The billionaire who knew every detail of stock trends, who remembered every clause in contracts, could not answer the simplest questions about Andrew's health. And that realization cut deeper than any loss he had ever faced. Hours passed like lifetimes. Victor sat in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic, his tailored suit rumpled, his tie discarded, his mind replaying Maya's voice again and again. Who was she? Why had she called when everyone else ignored his son? And what debt did he owe to someone who came from a world so far beneath his own? Maya, meanwhile, had returned home after giving her statement to the paramedics. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't even expect to see Andrew again. She told herself she'd done what anyone should have done, but deep down, she knew better. Most people wouldn't have risked involvement, not in her neighborhood, not with a boy who looked like he came from money and trouble. Her grandmother noticed her shaken state when she walked in. But Maya brushed it off, saying she was just tired. Inside, though, she couldn't let go of the boy's pale face, the weight of his life pressed into her hands. She had no idea that the phone call she made would ripple into her life in ways she couldn't imagine. Back at the hospital, Andrew's condition stabilized, but he remained unconscious. Doctors explained he had overdosed, alcohol mixed with pills, a dangerous combination that nearly shut down his system. If someone hadn't intervened when they did, one doctor told Victor, he wouldn't have made it here alive. Those words echoed in Victor's mind. Someone, not him. Not his wealth, not his security team, a stranger, a girl he didn't even know. For the first time in years, Victor felt powerless in the truest sense, not because of markets or rivals, but because money hadn't saved his son. Humanity had, compassion had, and it had come from a place he least expected. When Andrew finally opened his eyes days later, weak and disoriented, Victor was at his side. Relief washed over him, but so did anger, not at Andrew, but at himself. He had failed his boy not with neglect, but with indulgence, with blindness, with walls built so high that he couldn't see what was crumbling inside. Victor's mind turned again to Maya. He couldn't let it end there. He needed to find her, not only to thank her, but because something in him knew she held a truth he hadn't been willing to face. The morning after Andrew's near death, the Harrington mansion stood in uneasy silence. Staff whispered in corners, the press swarmed outside the gates, and the air was thick with scandal. Headlines were already spreading. Billionaire's son hospitalized after overdose, and Victor knew the vultures of public opinion wouldn't wait for the truth. He sat alone in his study, staring at the polished mahogany desk that once symbolized control. Now it felt like a barrier. He had wealth, power, influence, but none of it mattered against the image of his son sprawled unconscious on the street, saved not by privilege, but by a stranger. That stranger, Maya. Victor had tracked her down with ease. His resources made it simple, too simple. But finding her was only the first step. The question gnawed at him. How could he face someone who owed him nothing, yet gave him everything? When he arrived at the modest neighborhood where Maya lived, his black car drew stares. Kids paused mid-game, neighbors watched suspiciously, and Maya herself froze when she stepped outside, a basket of laundry in her arms. For a moment they only looked at each other. He, the man who ruled empires. She, the girl who worked shifts just to keep food on the table. The silence between them was louder than any words. Finally Victor spoke. His voice was steadier than he felt. "You saved my son's life." Maya blinked, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to retreat inside, to avoid the weight of a world that didn't belong to her. But another part, the part that had forced her to act that night, kept her rooted. "I did what anyone should have done," she said quietly. Victor shook his head. No, you did what no one else did. Everyone else walked by. You stayed. Maya set down the basket. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the cracks in the billionaire's polished armor. He wasn't here as the powerful Harrington. He was here as a father. But before she could answer, the sound of a camera shutter snapped through the air. Paparazzi had followed him. In seconds, flashes erupted, reporters shouting, "Who is she? Is she connected to the scandal? Was she with Andrew?" Maya's chest tightened. She wasn't built for this spotlight. Her life wasn't meant to be a headline. But Victor, seeing her flinch, stepped forward, placing himself between her and the chaos. "This girl saved my son," he barked at the cameras, his voice thunderous. "She owes none of you an explanation." "But I owe her everything." The reporters froze. For once, Victor wasn't protecting his empire. He was defending someone outside of it. The story exploded. Maya's name became tied to Andrew's survival. Strangers speculated about her motives, her background, her connection to the Harringtons. Some praised her bravery. Others accused her of chasing attention or leverage. The world was cruel, and Maya was unprepared for its glare. But Victor didn't retreat. Instead, he invited Maya to the hospital, insisting Andrew needed to see the person who had saved him. When Maya entered the room, Andrew's face paled. His memory of that night was blurry, but fragments returned. The streetlights, the weightlessness, the faint echo of a voice urging him to hold on. Now that voice had a face. "You," Andrew whispered, his throat dry. Maya gave a small nod. She didn't smile, didn't soften the truth. "You nearly died." The words hit harder than any reprimand. Andrew looked away, shame burning his features. He was used to indulgence, to mistakes swept under rugs of money. But here was someone who saw him not as a billionaire's son, not as a story, but as a human being who almost lost his life. Victor watched silently, the air charged. For the first time, his son wasn't facing a business partner, a tutor, or a family member. He was facing accountability. The climax came not in a shouted argument, but in the raw stillness of truth. Andrew's voice cracked. "Why would you care?" "You don't even know me?" Maya's eyes didn't waver. "Because you were dying, and because no one else cared enough to stop." Silence fell again, but this time it was heavy with meaning. Andrew's eyes welled with tears he didn't want to show. Victor's chest tightened at the sight. His boy, broken, finally confronting the emptiness money had hidden for years. In that hospital room, the walls of privilege collapsed. Billionaire, rescuer, and fallen heir. 3 lives colliding in a moment that stripped them of labels and left only raw humanity. Victor stepped closer to his son, his voice quiet but firm. "She's right. I should have seen it. I should have been there before it came to this." The admission stunned both Andrew and Maya. For a man like Victor, weakness was unheard of. But in this climax, it wasn't weakness, it was strength. The strength to finally face the truth. For Maya, it was overwhelming. She hadn't expected to change anyone's life. She hadn't expected to become the hinge between despair and redemption. But here she was, holding the weight of 2 worlds in her hands. The climax ended not with applause or forgiveness, but with a fragile understanding. Things could no longer remain as they were. The billionaire could no longer hide behind wealth. His son could no longer escape into recklessness. And Maya, the girl who refused to walk away, had become the spark that lit the reckoning. The days after the hospital confrontation were unlike anything the Harringtons had ever faced. The world wasn't looking at Victor for his financial empire anymore. It was looking at him as a father. The headlines weren't about corporate takeovers, but about a young man who had nearly lost his life, and the girl who refused to let it happen. Inside the hospital, Andrew's recovery was steady but fragile. His body healed faster than his pride. Every morning he woke to the reality that he hadn't been saved by privilege, nor by friends from his gilded circles, but by someone whose name he hadn't known until his collapse. That truth gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the shallow foundations on which he had built his life. Victor, meanwhile, began a transformation of his own. For decades, he had defined himself by power, deals, and appearances. But sitting in a hospital chair, night after night, watching his son's chest rise and fall, he realized how little any of that mattered compared to the beating heart of the boy he had nearly lost. The empire could crumble, the press could circle, but if Andrew had died, no empire would have mattered. And then there was Maya. She wanted none of the spotlight, yet it followed her relentlessly. Journalists camped outside her apartment. Bloggers twisted her story into half-truths and conspiracies. Some painted her as a saint, others as an opportunist. Through it all, Maya stayed quiet, returning to work, caring for her younger siblings, and refusing to let the noise define her. But she couldn't escape Victor's persistence. One evening, a car arrived at her modest home. Not a limousine, not a flashy statement, just a quiet black sedan. Victor stepped out alone. When Maya opened the door, she braced herself for another flood of attention. Instead, she found a man stripped of ego. "I'm not here to drag you further into this," Victor said, his voice low, almost weary. "I just wanted to thank you, properly." Maya crossed her arms, skeptical. "You already thanked me," he nodded. "Then let me say something else." You opened my eyes. To my son, to myself, and to the way people like me forget the value of those outside our circles. I can't change the past, but I can start now. For the first time, Maya saw not the billionaire, but the father, a man desperate to rewrite the ending to a story that had almost ended in tragedy. In the weeks that followed, Victor acted on his words. Not through flashy donations for publicity, but through tangible change. He pulled Andrew out of the toxic environments that had fed his recklessness, surrounding him instead with mentors who cared about substance over status. He hired counselors, not to polish his son's image, but to heal the wounds money had long concealed, and perhaps most strikingly, he reached out to Maya, not to elevate her as a spectacle, but to involve her in shaping Andrew's recovery. She had become the one voice he listened to without defense. At first, Maya resisted. She didn't want to be absorbed into a world she didn't trust. But as Andrew slowly opened up, as she saw him wrestle with the fragility of his second chance, she realized her role wasn't about the Harringtons' wealth, it was about humanity. The change in Andrew was slow but undeniable. He started volunteering at the very community centers his father had once overlooked. He listened more than he spoke. He asked Maya about her life, her struggles, her resilience. For the first time, he wanted to understand a world outside his own. The impact rippled outward. The public, accustomed to billionaire scandals fading into silence, was stunned when the Harringtons didn't bury the story, but embraced its lessons. Victor spoke openly about privilege and blindness, about how it took a stranger's courage to save what he had taken for granted. He poured resources not into saving his reputation, but into funding addiction treatment programs and community outreach, quietly, without cameras. People noticed. The narrative shifted. Maya was no longer painted as a mystery girl seeking fame, but as the quiet spark behind a billionaire family's transformation. She didn't become a celebrity, but she became something far more enduring. An example of how one act of humanity could ripple across lives far larger than her own. For Maya herself, the impact was bittersweet. She didn't want fame, but she couldn't deny the changes it brought. Opportunities arose, scholarships, community recognition, platforms she never imagined. She accepted only what aligned with her values, refusing to be swallowed by the same spotlight that had once threatened to consume her. In private moments, she often reflected on the night it all began. She hadn't saved Andrew to change a billionaire family. She hadn't whispered his name into the darkness for recognition. She had acted because it was right, and in doing so, she had unknowingly rewritten the course of lives that seemed untouchable. The story's resolution came not with a dramatic finale, but with quiet, lasting shifts. A billionaire who learned the limits of money and the depth of humility. A young man who stared death in the face and chose to rebuild from ashes. A girl who refused to walk by, proving that dignity and courage don't need wealth to have power. The long-term consequences were undeniable. Victor Harrington's empire remained, but it no longer defined him. Andrew Harrington carried scars, but also purpose. And Maya, ordinary, resilient Maya, remained true to herself, even as the world tried to redefine her. The powerful takeaway was clear. Sometimes the greatest impact doesn't come from wealth, influence, or privilege, but from the quiet bravery of those who act when no one else will. And in that truth, The Harrington story was no longer one of scandal. It was one of redemption.